Plan for this week. I'm going to finish up the chapter tomorrow on notes. We'll talk about the Crusades, all right, so you guys can get prepared. Then Thursday we'll review. We'll do the Kahoot. And then Friday will be our test on a Google form. All right, so test on Friday over this chapter. There's quite a bit of notes on this, so this is actually the 8 notes that are associated with this chapter. All right, so yeah.
Can we have Kahoot music this time?
Well, yes, now we can probably do Kahoot music, I think.
All right.
Yeah, I think we can do Kahoot music.
We should play my mixtape.
Or your mixtape, we could probably do. Well, my mixtape is dropping in.
Oh yeah, no, definitely your mixtape.
Yeah, my mixtape's dropping in April. All right, so for the most part, with the exception of talking like about Russian history and that, we've been mainly talking about Western Europe, right? And so the beginning of this chapter, like I said, they kind of mark the beginning of the kind of early Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages, right? With the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, right? 476 was a significant date. This mainly, though, appears in the 18th century when there's a British historian by the name of Edward Gibbon who writes a book called The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, which essentially was the quintessential kind of historical book on the Roman Empire. He marks that day, he kind of signifies that day because that's the time the last emperor in the West, that kid, Romulus Augustulus, who was 14, was basically kind of like overthrown by that Ostrogoth chieftain who by the name of Odoacer. And he just basically took the title king of Italy, all right? Like I said, at that time, basically that when it was the newspaper had been relegated to the back page, all right? In reality, the Roman Empire, because remember, they split the empire into eastern and western half. A lot of that was based on language, right? So what language was mainly spoken in the western half?
Latin.
Latin, good, okay. And what was spoken in the eastern half?
Greek.
Greek. So the Greek half is going to basically extend into the 15th century, all right? And so historians kind of separate that and refer to that Eastern Roman Empire starting in the kind of like 6th century into the 15th century, all right? And that's the Byzantine Empire, all right? Now, those who lived at this time would refer to themselves as Rome. All right, like I was telling you guys, when Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III, there was already an emperor in Constantinople. He was basically like, what are you talking about? There's an emperor right here. What do you mean? All right. So you can say that this technically starts when the Emperor Constantine, who we had talked about, reunifies Rome under one leadership and then moves the capital to a city that was initially known as Byzantium. All right. So what he's doing here is essentially kind of setting up the kind of the foundation for the Byzantine Empire. All right, so this is essentially what the Byzantine Empire looked like. But they, like I said, they were Romans. All right, so it's Greece, the Balkans, Asia Minor, i.e. Turkey, into Palestine, Syria, Egypt. All right, now even towards the tail end of the Roman Empire, before even like Constantine, there was like Diocletian. They were shifting a bit. All right, this was the richest half of the empire. All right, so it only made sense as the richest half kind of continued on longer than the western half. All right, the capital of the Byzantine Empire was that city that. Byzantium that Constantine renamed after himself. He's a bit of a narcissist, and that's Constantinople. Now, Constantinople was strategic, and it represented Constantine's new faith. Remember, although he doesn't make it the official religion, Constantine was what? The first one to embrace what religion? Christianity, right? He brings it up from the shadows. The Edict of Milan basically states that it's a religion that's to be kind of recognized, if you will, right? So he could build that doesn't have the trappings of the old kind of religion. Also, too, this was strategic. Militarily, because after solidifying power, he understood that their superpower that was a challenge was the Persians, the Parthians to the east, as well as this is a crossroads of trade. A lot of the goods that are coming out of the Silk Road and stuff like that are coming through Constantinople. So there's a kind of a harbor called the Golden Horn because it kind of jutted out into the Sea of Marmara, right? And also, it's easier to defend. Because to kind of siege it, you're going to have to do a lot of basically amphibious sieging from Rome. All right. So essentially, kind of like this is why they refer to it as the Golden Horn. It kind of juts out into kind of the Sea of Marmara from a more kind of eye level. You got to see that's at the crossroads of the Sea of Marmara, Bosporus Straits, which lead into the Golden Horn, which leads into the Black Sea. Sea of Marmara leads into the Mediterranean. So it's at a definite crossroads there. This is what it looks like from today. About a population of like 9 million, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Now, it's not known as Constantinople today. Does anybody know what it's called? Istanbul. Good. Yeah. Istanbul is a Greek term meaning into the city. It's renamed by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. All right. And so it's the largest city in Turkey. Now, it's at heart, though, a Roman city. It's designed in its kind of like patterns as a Roman city, all right, with streets and kind of stuff like that. But also, too, like in Roman cities, even Greek cities before, you would have agoras and forums and that. For Constantinople is the Messe, the middle way. Right, that's where the main marketplace, where you basically all these goods that were coming from the east would kind of make their way through, and eventually some of them would make their way west into Europe. Right, and then also the Romans love and being entertained. Right, so we had talked about like gladiator fights. Right, the Romans were kind of fascinated by that stuff. However, when Emperor Theodosius becomes emperor, all right, he outlaws gladiator fights. They don't represent the new religion. All right, and also too, a lot of Christians were kind of like sacrificed in the games. So what replaces gladiator fights is horse racing, chariot racing. So in the city of Rome, there was something that was built during kind of the period of the Republic called Circus Maximus, which was essentially a big racetrack. Constantinople, they recreated Circus Maximus and they called it the Hippodrome. Hippo is a Greek word meaning horse. So like hippopotamus means Greek horse, right? It means river horse. I'm sorry, in Greek, right? So this became the center of kind of like the kind of entertainment for the Romans. And what we start to see teams develop. All right, these teams based on colors. You had the blues, whites, greens, reds, I think yellows maybe in there. And I don't know if anybody follows like European soccer. A lot of times those teams will have like what they call firms. All right, so they'll have supporters groups that kind of like you know in England sometimes they're like hooligans and stuff like that. So we start to see kind of factions start to emerge. Some of them become rather political. Eventually, this becomes the sign of a major riot, which I'll talk a little bit later. All right, so this is the artist kind of a computer regeneration of it. It's no longer around today. All right, but to show its importance, it was actually the Hippodrome was actually connected to the royal palace. This right here is the emperor's box. So the emperor wouldn't even have to leave his home. Many times, the only time the Byzantines saw their emperor was at the games or was during at the racetrack. All right. Now, again, you might be like, geez, like I know you try to stay awake. I know, like I see people talk, but I show you guys these things. So I try to get on your levels. All right. I watch the MTVs. I try to find what the young adults are into. So I've learned 1, trap music, 2, chocolate milk, 3, chewing gum, 4, ham radios, 5, maps, graphs, and charts. Now, again, I can't be playing trap music if I'm like, I don't know, if I start bumping like Ugly God or something like that. Banging hammers is going to happen. I was raised on the west end of Belleville, but I represent the east, so I know how the streets work. And then chocolate milk, somebody may be lactose intolerant. I don't want to get you sick. Chewing gum, don't put your hands underneath these desks because you don't want to know what chewing gum can do. All right, there's some gum that dates back to the 70s in there. Ham radios, I think we have a policy against electronics, stuff like that, other than, of course, your cell phones, your Chromebooks, your laptops, your tablets, and copiers, I think. But math, graphs, and charts can hit you that all day, every day. Also, too, to take it to a whole nother level, this chart is in a different language. It's in French. No need to thank me. It's just part of my job. All right, just trying to take it to another level. This is what's left of the Hippodrome. It's in this park here in Istanbul. Now, again, like being Romans, they have obelisks that kind of represent kind of markers there. They're in the middle of the Hippodrome. This one is called the Step Obelisk, and the reason it's called that is when the Ottoman Turks took over, they had an elite military corps called the Janissaries. The Janissaries were known to like have these competitions where they would climb up the obelisk, with their hands and their feet to see who could race and win. Eventually, some Janissaries tried to gain an advantage on the other, would kind of pull some bricks out as they kind of went through there to use them as stems. All right, so that's all that's left of the Hippodrome right there. And then what I want you to know is like politically, religion ties in with governance in the Byzantine Empire. All right, the Byzantine Empire is technically a theocracy, right, where basically it's a religious state. The emperor is essentially kind of ruling in the name of Jesus, and then many times you would see images, mosaics, icons, which show the emperor basically hanging out with Jesus and the Virgin Mary and all that other stuff. All right. Also, too, when they would kind of, as the Byzantines came in contact with non-Christians, many times they'd give them two choices. You either convert to our style of Christianity or you lose your head. Muslims, as they were coming out later, would basically offer a tax called the jizya. The Byzantines initially didn't offer that. All right. And the Byzantine style of Christianity is often referred to as Eastern Orthodox. All right. Now, the deal here is at this time we don't know who's officially the head of the Christian world. All right, those in Western Europe believe it's the Bishop of Rome, the Papas, i.e. the Pope. Right. Those in the eastern half go with the Patriarch, the Bishop of Constantinople. Patriarch is the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, after 1453, what we start to see is there's nationalizing of these Orthodox churches. So there's a Greek Orthodox Church. There's one in Swansea, I think. So you got Greek Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox, Serbian, Belarusian, all those are basically nationalized. However, the kind of de facto head of all the Eastern Orthodox churches tends to be the Greek Orthodox Church. So the patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church 2 years ago just met with the Pope, Pope Francis. That was the first time that those two people, those two positions, actually met in person in like 1,200 years. All right, to show you, we'll talk about the division here. So it's not necessarily always based on theocracy. All right, it's more based on who's the rightful leadership of the Christian world, and we see that's kind of split emerging between the Eastern and Western churches. All right, now I want to focus on particularly one emperor. I want to talk about another one, but one in particular, by the name of Justinian. Often he's referred to as the last of the Romans. All right, so Justinian is going to try to reunify the empire, East and West. All right, Justinian comes to power in the 6th century. So keep in mind what's going on in Western Europe. We got the Franks that are basically kind of emerging after Clovis, the Merovingian dynasty, and stuff like that. You have the Visigoths in Spain and the Anglo-Saxons all fighting for control there. So Justinian, and we find Byzantine emperors that sometimes would rise through the ranks in kind of humble origins. Justinian tied his success to his uncle Justin, who kind of worked his way up through the imperial guard, and they basically brought his nephew with him to Constantinople. Justin ends up becoming emperor, and then when he dies, Justinian kind of succeeds him. Now, after Justinian becomes emperor, within like a year, he ends up marrying this woman named Theodora. Theodora was from even more kind of humble origins. Historians, mainly one guy named Procopius, who was Justinian's historian, claims that she was a circus performer. There's another term, bear dancer, but Procopius also implies that she might have been a prostitute. All right. So, however, she is going to basically kind of operate as his, like almost like his co-emperor. If she was born a man, she would have been emperor. All right. So there's a story in which the Nika riots occurred. The Nika riots, when these riots occurred at the Hippodrome, all of those kind of like all those factions that were kind of like supporting those various chariot teams all got together and they basically rioted in the streets of Constantinople. They burnt down the main church there. Justinian was ready to bounce. He was ready to head over to the Asia side and just abdicate his throne. All right. The story is Theodora saw him kind of doing that, getting his stuff together. And he's like, come on, let's go, we're leaving. She's like, I'm not going anywhere. I find that purple makes a perfectly good burial shroud. So what do you think that means? Purple makes a perfectly fine burial shroud.
She's ready to die.
She's ready to die because literally she started from nothing. It's like I will die an empress rather than I go back being kind of like just like kind of poor. All right. So the story, Copius states that she actually kind of built him up, and he ends up kind of basically kind of like getting back at the rioters. So the story was he agreed to their terms. He said, we'll negotiate, we'll meet at the Hippodrome. So about 1,200 of these kind of rioters, who were kind of like the leaders of the riot, basically came to the Hippodrome thinking that they're going to negotiate, basically get their terms heard by the emperor. The emperor Justinian locks the gates to the Hippodrome, has his soldiers completely slaughter all of them. All right, and then the rest of the people that were kind of drawn there bound them, and they basically kind of hunted them down. All right, so if it wasn't for Theodora, Justinian probably wouldn't be emperor for very long. All right, like I said, there's a historian by the name of Procopius who was the official kind of historian for Justinian. He wrote an official history that he let Justinian and Theodora read, and then we come to find he's got a secret history. All right, where he talks such horrible stuff about her. He goes into detail about her sexual exploits and stuff like that. In reality, he was probably making a lot of stuff up because she's a very kind of strong-willed woman that in a patriarchal society doesn't usually always kind of like bode well. All right, and so this is a mosaic of Justinian. This is his aureus, his gold coin, like Roman emperors would mint. This is a famous mosaic of Theodora with her retainers. This is in a basilica in Ravenna in Italy, and then this is in the same basilica, Justinian in the middle there, wearing the purple. Now the guy over to his right, he was the one who had ordered slaughter the rioters. This guy is going to help expand the Byzantine Empire. That's the general Belisarius. All right. So soon after the Nika riots, after power solidified, he sent Belisarius to North Africa. All right, and he conquered the Vandals. All right, and he brings back with him a lot of booty, all right, a lot of wealth. He has a triumph, and that basically gives Justinian an idea. All right, he can continue on this military conquest, all right, and bring back with him wealth. Now he could go fight the Persians, but that's not going to be that easy. So he decides to try to reunify the Eastern and Western Empire. So he goes to Italy. All right, and the Ostrogoths are in power there, and he eventually takes over Italy. That's why the basilicas were built there. So for a while there, for a brief period, we had the empire reunified. Unfortunately for Belisarius, and he spent a lot of time on basically in the east and western military campaigns, Justinian apparently got a little jealous of him and paranoid, claiming that Belisarius was positioning himself to usurp, take over. He basically propped up these charges of treason, and the legend is that he had Belisarius blinded. The man who reunifies the Eastern Western Empire and ended his days as a blind beggar. That's a legend. We don't know if it's true per se. All right. So I was just talking about taking over the Ostrogoths. This is essentially the kind of the geographical zenith or the height of the Byzantine Empire during the reign of Justinian. It will never be this large. All right. Yeah.
So, like, if he got like that far, or we was like all the way back at Rome, how come like they just stopped?
What do you mean?
Like when he got like back to Rome, I thought like
they continued on. They went to Spain and stuff like that. Yeah, and they conquered all of Italy. They defeated the Ostrogoths there. Yeah, but yeah, no, and then he would send him like there would be an issue in the east, so Belisarius would have to go deal with the Persians. All right, then he'd come back, have to deal with
he
the
just like
Ostrogoths.
send them back and
He
forth.
kept them sending them back and forth. Yeah, one way was to keep them occupied instead of feeling that he was going to overthrow them. All right, it was a little bit of paranoia. Now, other than kind of expanding kind of Byzantine territory, another agenda that he has is to essentially to kind of like solidify his power. You got to cloak it with some type of like kind of legality with that. So we had talked about like in like these Germanic tribes, a lot of them would like basically their form of justice was through the use of ordeals, right? We had talked about like where people like, are you guilty or innocent? Walk across hot coals, or are you guilty of that? Put your arm and grab a big rock out of a boiling cauldron. Oh, you might be a witch. Let's throw you into a lake and see if you float. All right. While Germanic cultures are doing that stuff, the Byzantines are looking to the past. They're looking to laws that date back to the time of the Roman Republic, all right, and trying to see if they can create a legal code so that will solidify kind of like Justinian's power. This is called the Code of Justinian, or the body of civil law, all right? And so this is going to be the basis layer for foundation for European law up until the arrival of Napoleon. Now, it's essentially broken into 4 parts, and he has a guy named Tribonian, who's what they call a jurist. He's kind of a legal expert. Develop a team to look through a lot of these old laws. So the first part is called the Codex. The Codex is made up of 5,000 laws that date back to the Roman Republic. Now, there's even more laws. A lot of them were thrown out, all right, to see if these are still useful. So any laws that are pertaining to the old religion, those were disregarded. But a lot of laws that pertain to like basically like, personal property, family law, criminal law stuff, those were still kept in there. All right, so you basically kind of streamline this a little bit. But you're looking into going into thousands upon thousands of laws to kind of narrow it down to 5,000. All right. Now, with each of these laws, right, you have, and the Romans had a kind of a legal system that was somewhat like ours, with the idea of looking at the evidence at hand, right, not depending on superstition for the most part. So to determine, a lot of times you would have those laws. There would be court cases or whatever, decisions made. So the second part was the digest, which is basically just like kind of all the decisions were made from these various laws. So you got to think. One law probably has hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions that are related to that. All right. This is what they refer to as precedent. And a lot of times, judges today will use precedents to determine their decisions that are made. This had about 50 volumes. This was just massive. This in and of itself was just like an endeavor that probably would have been absolutely insane to try to go through. And if I was Tribonian, I would be pissed off that Justinian's name is kind of associated with not mine, because I'm the one doing all the work. But he's the emperor. It is what it is. All right, and then to kind of determine these kind of laws and precedents, you have something that basically becomes a foundation for like law schools in Europe here. This thing called the Institutes, which is basically a law textbook that how you basically kind of like talk about the precedent established, how to use a legal code and stuff. Right now, when we talk about the High Middle Ages in Western Europe, when we talk about the development of universities like Bologna in Italy, and Sorbonne in Paris, and Oxford and Cambridge in England. The thing that drew people to those universities a lot of times is the fact that they had a copy of this, all right? And so they were some of the first, like kind of like in Western Europe, the first law school. And then the last part was the novella, which were the laws that were basically kind of created after the kind of compiling started, all right? Now, in the novella, some of these laws could be pretty heavy-handed and would classify as draconian. They a lot of times they reflected Justinian's very kind of like strict, rigid interpretation of kind of Christian morality. There was a law that if you got caught gambling with dice or whatever like that, get your hand cut off. Adultery, homosexuality were punishable by death. Any blasphemy against the emperor or God or the patriarch or something like that could be punishable as well. And there was a lot of laws on there based on taxation. He was not, later by the end, was not a very popular emperor because of his heavy-handed taxation methods. He would have tax collectors that had names like Edward Leninjaws. There was one guy that was strictly referred to as the Scissors, I think. All right, they were like kind of like mafia goons, if you will. All right, but this was a way to basically kind of compile his power, kind of cloak it in some legitimacy. And then, as being a Roman emperor, you build, right? They want to leave their name behind in stone and such, right? The structure that's most associated with Justinian is the Church of Holy Wisdom, the Hagia Sophia. Actually rebuilt. The one that stands right now was rebuilt after the Nika riots. All right, and so this was rebuilt to commemorate the reconquest of Rome and bringing the two basically eastern and western halves together, if you will. Anytime anybody talks about Istanbul, this is usually the thing that they show. All right, at one point it was the largest church in the world. All right, and so this is what it looked like at the time of the Byzantines. You see a lot of domes, arches, and stuff like that in Romanesque style. This is roughly what it looks like today. The four towers, those are minarets. All right, because when the Ottoman Turks took it over, they turned it into a mosque. Now, for a long period of time, it was a museum, but it was just recently in the news just this past year. I'm going to show you this video. This TED video that kind of talks about the transition Hagia Sophia made through it.
They say that if walls could talk, each building would have a story to tell. But few would tell so many fascinating stories in so many different voices as the Hagia Sophia, or Holy Wisdom. Perched at the crossroads of continents and cultures, it has seen massive changes from the name of the city where it stands to its own structure and purpose. And today, the elements from each era stand ready to tell their tales to any visitor who will listen. Even before you arrive at the Hagia Sophia, the ancient fortifications hint at the strategic importance of the surrounding city, founded as Byzantium by Greek colonists in 657 BCE, and successfully renamed as Augusta Antonia, New Rome, and Constantinople, as it was conquered, reconquered, destroyed, and rebuilt by various Greek, Persian, and Roman rulers over the following centuries. And it was within these walls that the first Megala Ecclesia, or Great Church, was built in the 4th century. Though it was soon burned to the ground in riots, it established the location for the region's main religious structure for centuries to come. Near the entrance, the marble stones with reliefs are the last reminders of the Second Church. Built in 415 CE, it was destroyed during the Nika riots of 532, when angry crowds at a chariot race nearly overthrew the Emperor Justinian I. Having barely managed to retain power, he resolved to rebuild the church on a grander scale, and 5 years later, the edifice you see before you was completed. As you step inside, the stones of the foundation and walls murmur tales from their homelands of Egypt and Syria, while columns taken from the Temple of Artemis recall a more ancient past. Runic inscriptions carved by the Vikings of the Emperor's elite guard carry the lore of distant northern lands. But your attention is caught by the grand dome representing the heavens. Reaching over 50 meters high and over 30 meters in diameter, and ringed by windows around its base, the golden dome appears suspended from heaven, light reflecting through its interior. Beneath its grandiose symbolism, the sturdy reinforcing Corinthian columns brought from Lebanon after the original dome was partially destroyed by an earthquake in 558 CE quietly remind you of its fragility and the engineering skill such a marvel requires. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, the mosaics from the next several centuries have the most to say, not only about their biblical themes, but also the Byzantine emperors who commissioned them, often depicted along with Christ. But beneath their loud and clear voices, one hears the haunting echoes of the damaged and missing mosaics and icons, desecrated and looted during the Latin occupation in the Fourth Crusade. Within the floor, the tomb inscription of Enrico Dandolo, the Venetian ruler who commanded the campaign, is a stark reminder of those 57 years that Hagia Sophia spent as a Roman Catholic church before returning to its Orthodox roots upon the Byzantine reconquest. But it would not remain a church for long. Weakened by the Crusades, Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453 and would be known as Istanbul thereafter. After allowing his soldiers 3 days of pillage, Sultan Mehmed II entered the building. Though heavily damaged, its grandeur was not lost on the young sultan, who immediately rededicated it to Allah, proclaiming that it would be the new imperial mosque. The 4 minarets built over the next century are the most obvious sign of this era, serving as architectural supports in addition to their religious purpose. But there are many others. Ornate candle holders relate Suleiman's conquest of Hungary, while giant calligraphy discs hung from the ceiling remind visitors for the first 4 caliphs who followed Muhammad. Though the building you see today still looks like a mosque, it is now a museum, a decision made in 1935 by Kemal Atatürk, the modernizing first president of Turkey following the Ottoman Empire's collapse. It was this secularization that allowed for removal of the carpets hiding the marble floor decorations and the plaster covering the Christian mosaics. Ongoing restoration work has allowed the multiplicity of voices in Hagia Sophia's long history to be heard again after centuries of silence. But conflict remains. Hidden mosaics cry out from beneath Islamic calligraphy, valuable pieces of history that cannot be uncovered without destroying others. Meanwhile, calls sound from both Muslim and Christian communities to return the building to its former religious purposes. The story of the divine wisdom may be far from over, but one can only hope that the many voices residing there will be able to tell their part for.
All right, so that's the interior there, like I just talked about. The 4 big discs there in Arabic, those represent the first 4 caliphs that we talked about in chapter 6, the Orthodox Caliphate. All right. Now, like the video there said, it's since 1935, it is a museum, right? That's changed as of last year. All right, the current president of Turkey, a guy named Erdogan, has reverted it back to a mosque. That's created some controversy because what ends up happening is that when it reverts back to a mosque, they're going to have to paint over all those mosaics they had uncovered. All right, so like the UN is a little concerned by this. Many people claim it's basically Erdogan's like kind of basically pandering to his religious base, the very kind of conservative kind of Muslims that are in Turkey there. So it may be in the news again. We don't know, but like I said, it was just last year that basically they changed that. All right. And then another thing is you don't need to type this down, but Justinian's policies, though, towards the end, he wasn't a most kind of beloved emperor. All right. Taxation was really, really heavy. And then at one point, there's a plague that the historians just simply refer to as the plague of Justinian. That basically ravaged Constantinople and just the areas outside that. It's essentially the same strain of the bubonic plague that's going to ravage Europe in the Black Death we talked about in the 14th century. Just about like 700 years different, if you will. All right. And then after Justinian dies, the empire, basically the trajectory is that it keeps on shrinking. When Islam emerges here, Muslims coming out, we talked about in chapter 6, took off parts of the Byzantine Empire. All right. At one point is basically that kind of weakening of the empire is halted for a brief period during an era in the 9th century referred to as the Macedonian dynasty. The guy who's credited with establishing the Macedonian dynasty is Basil I. Basil is somewhat similar to Justinian. They're a few hundred years apart, but both of them kind of came up in the ranks thanks to an uncle. All right. This time his was his uncle through marriage, the Emperor Michael. Michael was a little bit, from all accounts, a little bit maybe kind of overbearing. Matter of fact, he made Basil divorce his first wife and marry one of his mistresses. All right, who he ends up having a son with, but there's always this rumor that Basil's son, Leo, who becomes Leo the Wise, is actually Michael's son. At one point, Basil has Michael killed, all right, and he starts this dynasty. This dynasty also has some dudes with some pretty cool names.
Let me get what?
Or grab a lunch first. I repeat,
Hold up.
math team,
That's the last one.
Past test room 314 for the regional test after school today.
Oh, I thought we were getting to this. That was great. Everyone kind of screwed me up. Oh, there's another dude in this dynasty called Basil II. He's the one whose sister married Vladimir, and he's called Basil the Bulgar Slayer. When he defeated the Bulgars, he had his soldiers, 2 of them that were captured, Bulgarian soldiers. For every 100 he blind them, 99 blind them, the last one he had one. RoboCop says leave.
So, they're in prison. Are you gonna go get a lunch?
I have a snack.
I want to grab one. You know, your little spiel about chocolate milk and trap music is actually really funny.
It's true. I know what your kids like. I watch the